Welcome to this video, the introduction to exam topic 3, using operators and decision constructs. My name's Andy Wicks, and in this video we're going to look at the following exam objectives. We're going to have a look at how Java uses operators. We're going to look at the use of parentheses to override operator precedence. We're going to test equality between strings and other objects using equals equals and equals. And we're going to create and use if-else constructs. And then finally, we're going to look at switch statements. So let's get going with the first of these. 3.1, using Java operators. The first thing you need to know is that operators only work on primitive data types. So those are the data types that are native to Java, such as integer and Boolean. These can be assigned values. So if we have an integer variable that we've created called x, we can say x equals 3. And that means the content of variable x is now 3. We can perform arithmetic. So we can say x is equal to y plus 3. That looks into the contents of the variable y, adds 3 to it, and puts that value into the place of x. Then there are logical operators, and or. And is ampersand ampersand, and or is pipe pipe. So we can have a construct such as, if x is not equal to 3 and s is bigger than 5, do this. In that case, those commands will only be carried out if x is not 3 and s is bigger than 5. And finally, we have relational operators, such as not equal to. So if x is not equal to 3, do this. Let's have a look at a simple question on operators. Select all the correct statements in the following list. So have a read. Okay, let's go through these. Boolean b is equal to true. That sounds as if it ought to be correct, but notice that true is in quotation marks. That means it's being looked at as a string, and you can't put a string into a Boolean variable. So that is wrong. What about b, which is int I equals 3, so we're declaring an integer to be 3. If I is greater than 99.0, do this. Well, we can't compare an integer to a float. And if there's a decimal point in there, that's a floating point number. So that one is also incorrect. Next, a programmer cannot define new primitives. Well, primitives are things that come with Java. And no, the programmer cannot define new primitives. That is correct. What about D? Double D is equal to 7 plus 3. Well, 7 and 3 are integers, and D is a double. So will that work? Well, yes, doubles include integers. So double D equals 7 plus 3 will work. And finally, char c is equal to x. If c dot equals 2, do this. Well, that's wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we're defining a char, it's got to be single quotation marks, not double quotation marks. Double quotation marks means it's a string. If C equals, well, since C is a primitive data type, we should be using equals equals. And C couldn't be equal to a string, because a string is a character. And since the 2 is in quotation marks, it's being handled as a string. So there's lots wrong with that command. Now let's move on to 3.2, using parentheses to override operator precedence. Do you remember when you were at school and you came across BODMAS and your teacher said, learn BODMAS, brackets, powers of, division and multiplication, addition and subtraction, and you had to learn that so that your arithmetic would work correctly? Well, the bad news is that it's also true in programming. Let's go through the individual bits. There are some extras in programming, but BODMAS is what you need to remember. You have unary operators, and those are things that happen before the variable name. So plus plus x, or minus minus y, or not, whatever is in the value boolean, are all done first. So before we do anything else, those happen. Then you have things like multiplication and division and remainders. So 2 times x, or y divided by 5, or 7 remainder 3, will all happen next. Then you have addition and subtraction. So 2 plus 3, or 7 take away 5, will happen after multiplication, division and remainder. Then relational operators are done. So brackets and less than. If x is less than or equal to 27, and that will then be done. Equality. If x is not equal to y, or if x equals y, that will be done next. Logical AND will happen. So if there are 2 conditions in an if statement, if this and that happens after the equality. Logical OR happens after the AND. So ANDs take precedence over OR. And finally, assignment. So once all the arithmetic has been performed, once all the comparisons have been made, we can then assign things to variables. So we can have x is equal to y times 2, or x is equal to x times 2, or x is equal to whatever is in x, well, the remainder of that when you divide by 3. Let's have a look at a question. What does the code below produce? Int a is equal to 1. Long b is equal to 2. Short c is equal to 3. Then print out plus plus a plus b plus plus times c. I'll give you a moment to work it out. Okay, let's get going. The first thing to notice is that there are no brackets inside the println bracket. So those we don't need to worry about. Now we come down to all the other stuff. Multiplication happens after the unary operator. So the first thing that gets done is 1 is added to a. So a is now 2. The next thing that gets done is multiplication. What is in B, which is 2, is multiplied by whatever is in C, 3. So 2 times 3 is 6. Now we can do addition. 6 plus 2 is 8. So what will be output is 8. And after it's been output, B will be increased by 1. But that would happen in later commands. So B doesn't change until we've output the value of this expression. Let's move on. Let's test the equality between strings and other objects using equals equals and equals. Well, for primitives, we use equals. So integer x is being defined as being 9. If x equals is the same as 3, then we can do whatever is in the curly brackets. Whereas for objects, well, strings are objects. So we can have a string s, which we're setting to Jill. Now we can say if s equals Andy, do whatever is in the curly brackets. We could use this to check to see whether there is a different string that's being used. So we could have if s equals open brackets variable called p, which is also a string, that would also work. Now let's try a simple question again. Let's assume we have a class called student with a field called name, and those are defined. Which of the lines of code below will not compile? I'll give you a moment to try. Okay, think you've got the answer? Well, obviously the numbers to the left of the code wouldn't be there in Java, but that aside, lines 1 and 2 merely define two new objects of type student. Those will work. Then we've got Asif being assigned to the variable Asif. It's not a variable, it's an object. And we can't assign a literal to an object. So line 3 will give an error. In line 4, we've got the object .name being set to Asif. Well, assuming that name is correctly typed as a string, that will work. So line 4 is correct. Notice that we've got the same object, Asif, being assigned a different literal string value. Well, that must also be wrong. So line 5 is also incorrect. Line 6 takes the object Asif, takes the name field in that, and now assigns it the text Andy. I'm overwriting Asif, but that wouldn't matter. That line will compile. And finally, systemout.println asif.equals Andy, well, they are both of the same type. They are both of type student. Therefore, that line will also compile correctly. So the answer to this is that lines 3 and 5 are the ones that will not compile, because we're trying to assign a literal to an object. C is the correct answer. Now let's move on to creating and using if-else constructs. all conditions in if-else constructs are in brackets. Compound conditions are nested within the brackets. And there's not a then in Java. That's only true of Visual Basic. So for those of you who've done Visual Basic before, unfortunately the then has to be lost. So let's look at some code. On the left-hand column, we've got if x is equal to or greater than 5, and then some curly brackets. Whatever is in those curly brackets will only be performed if x is 5 or more. If x isn't 5 or more, if x were 3, nothing would happen at all. We just continue with the command after that final curly bracket. In the middle column, we're using an if-else. So if x is greater than or equal to 5, do this, else do that. The top section of code will only be performed if x is 5 or more. If x is less than 5, then whatever is in the else will happen. So if x were 7, the top section would be used. If x were 3, the bottom section. And finally, the right-hand column. That's using an if, else if, else. This gets a little more complicated. If x is greater than or equal to 5, well, what's between those curly brackets will only happen if x is more than 5. But if x isn't more than 5, we can have other else-ifs. So in this case, we're checking whether x is the same as 2. If x is the same as 2, then it does whatever code is in that middle section. Else, so if x is less than 5 and x is not equal to 2, do this. That is the more complicated route. Now, how about a little question? Look at the code on the right and decide what is output. I'll give you a moment. This is a typical Java test trick question. Let's follow the logic through. Int a is equal to 10. So there's an integer, a, that now contains 10. If a++ is 10, well, let's check this out. What happens? It checks whether a is bigger than 10, and once it's checked that, it then increments a. So that ++a only happens after the test has been carried out. Remember the precedence rules. So that if will not happen because a is not bigger than 10. A is still at 10. So it won't print out true. But what about the next bits of code? There is no else. And because there's no else, systemout.print false will happen regardless of that if statement above. And likewise, systemoutprint will happen regardless anyway. So what will actually be output is false ABC. In other words, answer B is the correct one. Bit tricky, huh? Look out for those in the test. So let's move on to 3.5 using a switch statement. These are used with primitive and object variables. Let's have a look at some code. Let's suppose that you've done a test and you've got 77%. Now I know that's low for you, but stick with me, it's a Java example. What we're going to do is we're going to check which class of result you've got. So switch int marks divided by 10 will convert the marks divided by 10 and cast it as an integer. We can now check what sort of thing is happening. So in the first case, case 4, if the result of that was something that was 4, remember integers can only be whole numbers, so if you got 45 for example, 45 divided by 10 turned into an integer would just be 4, it would print third and then break out of the switch altogether. If you got something in the 50s, it would print 2.2 and again break out of the switch. Next, if you got something in the 60s, it would print 2.1 and break. Now the next line, case 7, case 8, case 9, should also have a case 10 because you could get 100% and you probably will. But in this case I didn't have room to put that in. But if you got in the 70s, 80s or 100%, you get a first. So break. Now the default, in other words, if you didn't get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10, is that you have to resit. And that's how a switch statement works. So let's look at a question on switch. What's produced by the code below? Again, I'll give you a moment to have a think. Okay, ready yet? Well, this is another one of those trick questions. Final doesn't make any difference here. It's just noise to try and confuse you. We've got two variables, x and y. We're going to switch on the contents of x. But the case statements must take actual values. They can't take variables. So in this case, case y, the whole program will not compile. So the answer is E. It would only produce something if it said case 20. If it said case 20, it would print out y plus 3. And if it had case anything else, 33 for example, it would print out x plus 3. But this won't compile at all. So the correct answer is E. Bit tricky, huh? Okay, we've completed this topic, but there is a lot more that you can do for exam topic 3. This is just an introduction to the exam topic. To do well in the exam, you're going to need to study further. Go to the Moodle site for the course, and there find the links to the Oracle Java tutorial for using operators and decision constructs. Once there, see the list of sections in the Mala Gupta book that are relevant to using operators and decision constructs. She has a lot of good stuff in there. And then feel free to post questions and help other students in the Using Operators and Decisions forum. That will help you and will help others. Do well, I'm sure you will.